So today we'll be discussing about stretch reflex. So what is reflex? Reflex is an involuntary response to a sensory stimulus. And in case of stretch reflex, when a muscle is stretched, it contracts. So in this case, stretch is the stimulus and the resultant contraction is the response. It is a monosynaptic reflex arc, and let us see what are the components of this stretch reflex. So the sensory nerve endings, they get stimulated when the muscle is stretched. They pass the impulse to the afferent neurons or the primary afferent nerves. These carry the impulses to the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord in this case, and from there the impulses are passed via the efferent nerves or the efferent neurons to the effector organ, which is the muscle. So before going into detail about the physiology of stretch reflex, let us know some more about the muscle fibers. The muscle fibers or the muscle cells can be divided into extrafusal and intrafusal. The extrafusal fibers, they form the bulk of the muscle and they have the contractile ability. The intrafusal muscles are specialized muscle cells and they have the sensory nerve endings or the sensory receptors. The extrafusal muscles fibers are innervated by the alpha motor neurons. The intrafusal muscle fibers are innervated by the gamma motor neurons. The intrafusal muscle fibers are encapsulated and occur as muscle spindles in the fibers. They have contractile and non-contractile elements. So, let us see what a stretch reflex is. As you can see, this is the muscle and these are the extrafusal muscle fibers. This is the encapsulated intrafusal muscle fiber. The sensory nerve ending, they are attached to the non-contractile element of the intrafusal muscle fibers. So when stretch is applied, the sensory nerve endings which is attached to the non-contractile portion of the intrafusal muscle fibers will pass the impulse via the primary afferent nerve fiber. In this case, it is 1A afferent neuron to the spinal cord. The type of nerve fiber depends on whether it is myelinated or non-myelinated. It depends on the conduction velocity of the impulses and also depends on the thickness of the nerve fiber. So this afferent nerve fiber carries the impulses from the sensory nerve ending connected to the intrafusal muscle fibers and enters the dorsal column of the spinal cord. And it synapses with the alpha motor neuron present in the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord. This is a monosynaptic excitatory synapse. So the information from the alpha motor neuron passes via its axon to the extrafusal muscle fibers. The axon of the alpha motor neuron branches at its terminal of this extrafusal muscle fibers, and this unit together is called as the motor unit. So the excitation of the alpha motor neuron causes the contraction of the extrafusal muscle fibers and thus the muscle as a bulk contracts. So this is what is called as the stretch reflex. So when the muscle is stretched, the impulses pass through the afferent neuron and then the contraction is done by the impulses from the alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron have their cell bodies in the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord and also in the motor cranial nerve nuclei. The stretch reflex is very essential to maintain the muscle tone and also the posture of the body. So when the muscle tone is high, then on palpation the muscle will form rigid or it is firm and it offers subsequent resistance to passive movement. Whereas when the muscle tone is less, it appears, or when we palpate, it looks flaccid and it does not offer enough resistance to passive movement. Apart from the alpha motor neurons in the ventral gray column, we also have another group of neurons called the gamma motor neurons. These gamma motor neurons innervate the contractile elements of the intrafusal muscle fibers. Once the gamma motor neurons are stimulated, it causes contraction of the intrafusal muscle fibers via the contractile elements. When the intrafusal muscle fibers are contracted, it produces tension in the sensory nerve endings that are present in the intrafusal muscle fibers. The increased tension in the sensory nerve fibers causes the decrease in the threshold of sensory nerve endings to external stretch stimulus. So this causes increased sensitivity of the stretch reflex. This is called as a gamma reflex loop. So the main importance or the prime essence of the gamma reflex loop is to maintain the sensitivity of the stretch reflex. The nuclei of the gamma motor neurons are also present in the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord and also in the motor cranial nerve nuclei. Both the alpha motor neurons and the gamma motor neurons are under the influence of the descending pathways from the brain. So, if there is any pathology from the descending pathways from the brain, it affects both the alpha motor neurons and the gamma motor neurons. For example, in cases of stroke where the upper motor neurons are involved or when there is a pathology affecting the upper motor neurons, it affects the dynamic gamma motor neurons. The dynamic gamma motor neurons innervate the nuclear bag fibers, which is a kind of intrafusal fibers. When the dynamic gamma motor neurons are affected, it causes exaggerated reflexes, a term called hyperreflexia, and spasticity of muscles. In conditions where basal ganglia are involved, when there is a pathology in basal ganglia, for example, Parkinson's disease, the static gamma motor neurons are affected. The static gamma motor neurons, they innervate the nuclear chain fibers. The nuclear chain fibers are also a type of intrafusal muscle fibers. When the static gamma motor neurons are affected, it results in rigidity of the muscles throughout the passive movement, whereas the reflexes are normal. Another important factor which has to be mentioned in stretch reflex is the reciprocal innervation. For example, when we are eliciting a patellar reflex, we strike the patellar tendon. The impulse from the tendon will be carried via the quadriceps muscle. So we know that quadriceps is the extensor, it is lying in the extensor compartment of the thigh. So the impulse from the quadriceps muscle, when it is stretched, the intrafusal muscle fiber here, it is being stimulated. As we know that the sensory nerve endings which are attached to the non-contractile part of this intrafusal muscle fiber are stimulated, they transmit the impulse via the 1A or the primary afferent neuron in this case. And from there, it reaches the ventral gray horn and synapses with the alpha motor neuron. This causes the contraction of the extrafusal fibers of the quadriceps muscle. This causes the knee extension. But not only the impulse from the primary afferent neuron is transmitted to the alpha motor neuron of the ventral gray horn, but also to the inhibitory interneuron. The interneuron, which is inhibitory, will cause inhibition of impulses to the alpha motor neuron, which is supplying the extrafusal muscle fibers of the flexor compartment, thereby inhibiting the contraction of the flexor muscles. That is why when we elicit a patellar reflex, there is knee extension, whereas and there is no knee flexion because the antagonist muscle is being inhibited and there is only contraction of the quadriceps muscle or the agonist muscle. So this is called as reciprocal innervation.